Hi, everybody. This is Blaine DeSantis, and I welcome you to another edition of Books and Looks. Yes, it's our weekly voyage of discovery in the wonderful world of books. Books that I've been reading and authors that I've been interviewing. And if you like books, then this is the book for you. This week, we're talking with Dr. Evan Friss. Dr. Friss has written a book called The Bookshop, A History of the American Bookstore. This is a wonderful, wonderful five-star read. Let me tell you what, this book is come out 2 weeks ago. It's already on the New York Times bestseller list. Okay. It's already been gotten glowing reviews on the Wall Street Journal, the LA Times. Dr. Friss has been in People magazine, and he decided to spend some time with us. I feel so honored and so privileged that Dr. Friss would do this. He takes us on the history of books in America, from Ben Franklin all the way up to Amazon. And we start talking at the end, talking about why did Costco stop selling books and what's going to happen when more audible books are now being sold than ebooks. And we talk all about the development from mobile books to books in department stores, had their own bookstores in there. It's a wonderful discussion. You're going to learn so much about books. Like I said, it's just an amazing that somebody would write a nonfiction book about books, because I get so many titles sent to me about the bookstore, this about the bookstore, that, and they're all romantic comedies. They're all mysteries. There's, one of the cozy mysteries. This is just about bookstores, and you will love to hear about. And this book, you're going to love it, and you're going to want to go out and get it. You're going to want to get this book because this is a 5-star read. So anyway, enough from me. Let's go right to our interview with Dr. Evan Friss. All right, friends, as I said, I'm today with Dr. Evan Friss, who's here with us to talk about his newest book, The Bookshop, A History of the American Bookstore. Evan, welcome to Books and Looks.
Thanks so much for having me.
Folks, if you like books, then this is the book for you, because you're going to talk nothing about bookstores and where we can find books. It's a wonderful, wonderful book, and you're going to really enjoy this. So let's talk a little bit, though, about you, Evan. I think you're a college professor, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, I teach American history here at James Madison University, which is in the Shenandoah Valley in the western portions of Virginia. And I've been here for about 12 years now, and went to graduate school up in New York City and got a PhD in American history. Got lucky enough to find a job here, and have been professing ever since.
Wow. Do you have an era or a time period that you specialize in your history teaching?
So early on, I would say my area of interest and expertise was really American urban history. And I wrote a couple of earlier books about city planning and bicycles and transportation. So that was my initial focus. And this book, bookstores, of course, tend to be concentrated in urban areas, but it's a little less in that field and more of a general history.
Bicycling. I saw that. That's a fascinating topic that you would write about that. Wow. Were you a bicyclist?
I was, and in New York, I often found that it was the most efficient way to get from A to B, and used it often as a commuting tool. And being in New York and riding to school and to work and to friends' apartments, I began to ask questions about why the landscape was the way it was, and why there weren't more fellow cyclists with me, and why there were more bicycles in other cities. So it was really started from a kind of practical experience and questions to think about why the bicycle is kind of a marginalized vehicle in the United States. And the bookstore project was similar in a way. Like, why weren't there more bookstores around when I was an adult living in New York City? And why were they endangered? And how did we get to this spot?
Yeah. What made you want to write, though, about the bookshop? What was there a specific incident that you felt compelled you to write about this?
It was really my wife, who was then my girlfriend. So we were living together in the West Village of New York in a 6th-floor walk-up, 250 square foot apartment with no air conditioning, but it was great. And I was going to graduate school, and she got a job at the local indie bookshop called 3 Lives on the corner of Waverly and West 10th. And she didn't honestly know much about it, but just happened to kind of stumble into this magical world and get a job at one of the finest bookstores in the whole of the United States. And so it was through her experience and me visiting her and her talking about the bookstore and the people who came and her fellow colleagues who worked there that I began to appreciate, to some small degree, how important bookstores as an institution are. And that planted the seed for someday writing a book about the history.
It's interesting because you begin your book uh, with a topic about who's all part of the bookstore, and even the UPS driver, if I'm not mistaken, is part of the family that's in the bookstore. Uh, is that unique to that store, or are all bookstores that you found sort of like that?
I think, bookstores are kind of models of community spaces. And I'm sure there are other retail establishments that, depend on the FedEx or UPS driver. But bookstores are a unique proposition, and they depend on the lifeblood is books that arrive every day. All new books come out on Tuesday. And so booksellers tend to get to know their UPS driver well. And I still remember Vaughn, who was the UPS driver at Three Lives. I know the UPS driver at my wife's current bookstore here in Harrisonburg, Josh, and he's a part of the fabric of the store, and is one part of the community that makes up a great bookstore.
Nothing better than those books come in. You crack open the carton and see what's in there.
No matter how many books come in, that's still a joy for booksellers is to see books, especially new books that are just coming out.
No doubt about it. Well, now the book is called The Bookshop, but then you call it A History of the American Bookstore. Is there a difference between a bookshop and a bookstore?
Well, they're practically synonymous terms here in the United States now. That wasn't always necessarily the case. And I have a little bit in the book about some of the tensions between bookstores as for profit businesses, but also as spaces that have missions to educate people, inform people. And sometimes these different goals come to a kind of, or they operate in tension with one another. And there's a line in there about how the book business can almost seem oxymoronic. So there are some booksellers who prefer to think of their bookshops as shops, which maybe has a kind of warmer, cozier, less sort of explicitly capitalistic overtone to it. And the words, there used to be some distinction about how Americans use the term versus people in Europe. But for the most part, they're synonymous. And I wanted to include both words in the title because these days people find books by keyword searching. So if somebody was looking up the history of bookshops or the history of bookstores, hopefully they'd land on this one.
Folks, when we talk about this and when people are searching, this book, Friends, has been reviewed in the New York Times, in the Wall Street Journal. It has made the New York Times top 10 list, bestseller list, and it's been out only around 2 weeks. So we're talking about this is one very fine book, and apparently people are searching and finding it, aren't they, Doc?
It seems that way, unbelievably so. But yes, thank you for that.
Are you surprised about that?
Yes, because I knew people are passionate about the subject, and I'd like to think it's a good book, and I take some pride in that. And I thought that people who love books and bookstores were obviously a natural audience, but I'm also just some guy who's a professor at James Madison University. I don't have 3.5 million Instagram followers. I'm not even sure if I have 3.5 Instagram followers. A lot of people who crack the bestseller list are people who come with a built-in audience already. And that definitely was not me. So I think even my very supportive publisher, an editor, an agent, and everybody on my team was rooting for it, but we were all a bit surprised, and which is also why the book is already in its second printing.
Oh, that's great. Kudos to you. That's great stuff.
Thank you.
You mentioned cozy, you mentioned family. Is there anything that makes these little small bookshops inviting?
Sure. I think we are, as human beings, naturally attracted to books, which contain stories, ideas, pathways to all sorts of different worlds. And many of us, even if we're not readers or as adults, most of us had the experience of being read to as a child. And I think there's still a kind of childlike wonder that sticks to us with books. I write in the book, some of us think of them as kind of near holy objects. People, even if they have too many of them, struggle to get rid of them. Throwing a book in the trash feels icky and sort of unethical in a way that most of the other objects that we toss away don't. So I think there's something special, of course, about the product. And then walking into a place, if it's designed and curated in the right way, can really be a sensory experience like no other. And sociologists have found that being surrounded by books, mere proximity, matters and makes us feel good and warm and cozy. If you walk into the New York Public Library, one of the grandest architecturally stunning libraries in the world, you can't help but feel like you want to be a scholar, walking into the space. Everybody who walks in wants to read and write, and the space matters. And the same is true for a bookstore.
Wow. Also, it has a distinct odor, has that book smell, the binding or whatever it is. It just has an odor, be it a new book or an
Yeah.
old book. Man, I love it. And if you get a book and it happens to be warm, a warm day when that book's delivered, oh my God, the smell just wafts in. I love that. Oh my. Well, now you start us with a quote from Ben Franklin. I'm going to read it here, if you don't mind. He said, he understood that we are what we read, and that's dictated by what the authors choose to write, what the publishers choose to publish, and what the printers choose to print, and what booksellers choose to sell. That was true in the 18th century, but I don't know if that's still true anymore, is it?
I think it still holds true today. There are, of course, different kinds of platforms that have democratized publishing and bookselling. So anybody can write an independently published book on Amazon and sell it, and people can find it. Although there's so many of them, they're often hard to find. So there are certainly ways in which you can avoid all of the gatekeepers. On the other hand, there are more books in circulation than ever before. And so if you go to even a large bookstore, it has a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of the number of books in print. So those booksellers are deciding what you're going to see. First of all, what's carried in the store, but which books they put on the end caps, which ones they face out, which ones they have stacks of. And those are decisions that lead to people finding certain books and not finding other books. And if you sort of, go back into the chain of how books are made, publishers are rejecting proposals every day. So are agents that are basically required in order to get a contract with one of the larger publishers. They get inundated with, thousands of proposals a week, and they're making hard decisions about what they think will sell, what they think will be important, and the publishers are doing the same. And so there are a lot of different influential individuals and companies at every stage that dictates what shows up in the market and the books that we find and we can't.
So let's personalize that to you just a moment. Did you have an idea that someone's going to publish this book? I mean, or did you just decide I'm going to write a book and then I'll talk to somebody? How did you get to there?
I thought the subject matter had broad enough appeal that it might attract one of the big publishers. And I had written two previous books. Both of them were published by university presses, which tend to be much narrower markets and for scholarly audiences. So this was different from the outset. And people told me that it was a basically impossible task to just cold query agents. But somehow it worked, and I sent notes to 20 or 25 agents who on their website seemed like great agents and did what I call serious nonfiction books, but that had popular appeal. And somehow a few of them were interested, and I got a great one. And then she pitched it to editors, and somehow a bunch of them were interested, and we went with Viking. And so I wasn't sure that it was going to work out, and I was hoping that it would, but I also knew the odds were long. Um, and it takes a lot of, um, I wouldn't say it takes a lot of luck, but it takes some luck in addition to having a good idea and talent in order to succeed.
Get to the wrong agent, you get to the wrong, editor, publisher, it might not be the same.
I don't hold this against anybody. There were agents who said, I don't think this is really going to sell. And I think they were all making a guess. They were obviously wrong, but I don't think they were being malicious. They were making a judgment call. And everybody in publishing is frequently wrong. They underestimate, overestimate, and everybody's really just guessing. And it's a very hard thing to be able to predict.
Okay. Well, you move on from Ben Franklin to the Old Corner, which you call, I think, maybe the first American bookshop. How did that differ from Franklin's bookshop, and where was that located?
So Franklin's bookstore, I call a kind of proto bookstore because it was also a print shop. It was a post office. It was loud. They were making books there. It was messy. And even though there were a number of people who came to buy books, there really wasn't enough space to hang out or browse. And so I call the Old Corner, which was in Boston and emerged in the 1820s as what the kind of first modern American bookstore. That is a bookstore with lots of books on the shelves, a bookstore with lots of places to sit, a place to browse, a wide array of books and novels, which really weren't present in Ben Franklin's bookstore, and a place to just hang out. This was where people who wanted to talk books, this was another option other than a cafe or coffee house, a place to just inhabit and be and hang out with other writers and publishers and newspaper people. So it was a community space and a place that really people went to learn about new books coming out. So I sort of classify it as one of uh, the first modern American bookstores.
For everybody out there, who were some of that clientele that used to hang out at the Old Corner?
Yeah, Longfellow was a regular there. Nathaniel Hawthorne, uh, his favorite place to be was basically to sit in one of the offices with one of the two partners where he would be quiet and just kind of hang out. And he just loved being surrounded by the atmosphere. Oliver Wendell Holmes and other literary and also kind of political luminaries made it a regular stop. And this was a place that was also had its own publishing imprint. And so they printed Nathaniel Hawthorne and they printed Longfellow and many of the other customers. And it became not just a place to sell American literature, but a place where American literature flourished.
Mhm. Were other small bookstores at that time or as growing up, were they also publishing and printers, they publishers also?
So, in the earliest years, a lot of bookstores doubled as publishers and sometimes also as printers. And the retail market for books was obviously much smaller than it became. So, they needed to figure out other ways to make money. Many of the colonial population back in Franklin's day was illiterate, and literacy rates improved dramatically and steadily. But even by the time of the Old Corner, the market was still much smaller than it is today. And lots of early bookstores combined multiple functions.
Well, now we're going to move on from there to something called Parnassus. And Parnassus goes back into, if I'm not mistaken, that's Greek, if I'm not mistaken.
Mm-hmm. The mythological home of to the muses.
Okay, the home of the muses. All right. Well, it also shows up now. There's a book about Parnassus. There's all sorts of, and in fact, there's a mobile bookshop called Parnassus. Can you tell us a little bit about that, please?
Yeah, so people referred to the old corner in some ways, nicknamed it as Parnassus. And then the name shows up again, most famously in Christopher Morley's novel, which is about a group of traveling booksellers. And I won't give any of the plot away other than to say that it's a really kind of charming tale of a couple of booksellers on the road who get a mobile I don't want to say van because it's powered by a horse, but they turn this into a kind of bookstore on wheels, and it's a really charming tale. And then one of the co-founders of Parnassus, which is Ann Patchett's bookstore in Nashville, Tennessee, she joined forces with a woman named Karen Hayes to open Parnassus, this modern independent bookstore. And one of Karen Hayes's favorite books was Parnassus on Wheel. So it was an ode to the sort of mythological home, but also an ode to that book. And so they adopted that name.
Well, Christopher Morley's estate got some money from me because after you start writing about that, I decided I need to buy his books. So I have his whole collection of books now on my Kindle, but it's fascinating.
Yeah, I didn't know that much about Christopher Morley before I started researching this book, and his name shows up everywhere. So not only did he write, and he wrote a sequel to Parnassus on Wheels called The Haunted Bookshop. So not only did he write a couple of books about novels about bookstores, but he worked at the Old Corner bookstore, which I have a chapter about, and he was a regular at the Gotham Book Mart, which I have a chapter about, and he was very good friends with Marcella Burns Honor, who's the woman who ran the book section of Marshall Fields. So from especially the 1920s or so, he was at the center of American bookselling in many ways. And there was even a Parnassus on Wheels in real life that was modeled on his fictional tale.
Right. And I think one of the stories or one of the quotes from the story was, don't go to the beach. They don't buy books when they go to the shore, or something like that.
Yes, the people out on the beach don't have cash in hand and aren't necessarily the best customers they figured out.
That's cute. But by the way, now we had the mobile bookstore, and that got me thinking about uh, the books, the mobile book library, the bookmobiles. Do you think that flowed out of the Parnassus on Wheel, the mobile bookstores, or was that there before then?
Yeah, so there was a real boom in mobile book selling because of the novel and this romantic attachment to the idea of becoming this itinerant bookseller. Um, and there was this heyday lasted sort of until the Great Depression. But there have always been some mobile booksellers since. And actually, in recent times, it's become a stepping stone, and a lot of aspiring booksellers will start out of a van or get a kind of stall at a farmer's market, or sort of wade into the business by starting with a smaller sort of prototype model.
And I remember as a kid when the Reading Public Library had their bookmobile, and while you couldn't buy the books, we would go there, and when it showed up in the community, we'd go there and get our books.
Yeah.
That was really nice. I don't even know if there are many bookmobiles left anymore, if the public libraries are still doing that.
There's sometimes they're operated by sort of nonprofit entities that aren't necessarily the library, but community foundations that are often have the same mission of bringing literacy to children, directly in their neighborhoods, and like the ice cream truck kind of jingling their way into some neighborhood and trying to expose kids to books.
Great. That's great. Now, one of the characters, and I do a character in this book, is a lady who's known as the Czarina. Who is Czarina? And tell us a little bit about her function in the world of books.
Yeah, so her real name was Marcella Burns Honor, and she ran the book section of Marshall Fields from basically World War One to World War II, this critical period. And she's the one who makes the book section a book section from the beginning. So there were other department stores that decided to sell books, and Marshall Fields was a bit late to the game. But when they eventually jump all in, they hire her. She was a seasoned bookseller, super smart, and just an excellent salesperson to build out the section. And it's enormous, one of the largest, if not largest, bookstores in the United States. And calling it a bookstore seems kind of weird because, of course, it's inside of a department store, but it really felt like that. It was so big and it was so classy and so well manicured that it had its own aesthetic and feel and was prized as not just a large bookstore, but a great one that could hand sell books to its customers. And she was nicknamed the Tsarina because although she was very sweet to individual customers and would often, walk around with them hand in hand and give them all sorts of compliments, she could also be very tough when it came to Marshall Field executives who had ideas about what the book section should look like, and to publishers who she often um, told in frank language what she thought about their books or what they should be doing with certain titles, etc.
Wow. And what's interesting is it wasn't on the first floor. You had to do something to get up. Wasn't it on one of the top floors?
Yeah, so from from the time we had more than one story buildings, and from since bookstores existed in the United States, booksellers understood not being on the first floor as a kind of death knell, to not have that kind of window access to the passersby. But yeah, people, and Marshall Fields was a spectacle and a kind of emporium and empire on its own that drew a lot of people in. And many department stores had book departments because they added class to their department store. They were trying to attract the toniest kind of buyers, even if it wasn't the most lucrative kind of product to sell. But yeah, people were devoted to that book section, and they would sell, thousands and thousands of copies of a single book, compared to, small bookshops that were dealing in way, way lower volumes.
Wow. Well, you then go from new books into used books. And that's interesting because that's a whole different world selling used books. And you talk about something called Book Row. Where was that located? And tell us a little bit about Book Row.
So on Fourth Avenue in New York City for much of the 20th century, it waned by the 70s and 80s, and really is completely invisible today, other than the Strand bookstore, which was originally or on Book Row, and of course, dealt in used books. So this was a really fascinating neighborhood of books. It wasn't just a bookstore or a couple of bookstores on a block, but it was really a definitional feature of this part of New York, which stretched from basically Washington Square Park and NYU area up to close to Union Square along Fourth Avenue. And there were dozens and dozens of bookstores, mostly used, many of them specialized in different areas. And book lovers would descend here and hop from one shop to the next. And it had a character. It was, again, almost like a little book town. And the advantages of having so much competition around were really assuaged by the benefits of having so many different kind of books accessible, that it brought just hordes of people there regularly who loved to walk up and down Fourth Avenue. And many of the books were sold not just inside the shops, but on sidewalk stalls that extended out to the streets. And again, the Strand is the kind of a modern day conglomeration of all these shops, this very large bookstore that sells new and used books of every variety, and eventually moved just off of Fourth Avenue and just off of Book Row.
And the thing also, I think, is that as you said, there was a diversity of genres. One bookstore didn't necessarily, not going to have women's studies books next to another store of women's studies book. Everybody had a little different niche in there, and that helped, didn't it?
Sure. There were a lot of, especially considering the demographics of New York at the time, it makes sense. There was a lot of foreign language bookstores. So you'd have, a shop that sold Russian works, and you'd have a shop that specialized in antiquarian text, very old, not just used books, but old books, maybe ones that had some value. You'd have shops that sold magazines and shops that sold scientific or academic type of books, shops that specialized in philosophy or religious text. So it created this kind of spectacular, almost mall of different bookstore vendors, and many of which had their own character and contributed to this larger character of a book neighborhood.
What happened to Book Row that we're down to basically the Strand?
So, for a whole host of reasons, the number of bookstores dramatically declined by the 1980s. And used shops in particular, many of them struggled once we had the rise of mail order shops, and even more so in the 90s with things like, eBay and other ways to sell used or especially valuable books online where people could search for things without having to browse in person. But there were just lots of pressures on the bookstore industry in general. New York City, as you know, was a place that throughout the 80s and even more so 90s became much more expensive to live, but also much more expensive to rent out space. And so low profit margin businesses, books among them, became something very hard to run and justify in some of the most expensive real estate in the United States.
Hmm. Well, it's a shame because they were there. They served a good function. They educated a lot of people. Sometime they brought a little bit of revolution also, some of the things that were being sold there. But they had a definite function. And like you said, today we don't see too many of those anymore. The independent bookstore is now not, it's not going the way of the dodo, but boy, the number has really decreased. Do we know how many independent bookstores there are? Do we have that number?
I say it in the book. I can't remember off the top of my head from the last census, and the American Booksellers Association puts out yearly statistics. Both numbers are imperfect, and both entities that publish those numbers would admit as much. It's actually a complicated thing to figure out how many bookstores there are at any given time, because what counts as a bookstore and what doesn't, there are various different kinds of ways of defining it, and bookstores are constantly opening and closing. So there was a great decline in the number of indie bookstores. I will say that that decline slowed down and even leveled off. And in recent years, there's been a kind of um, a slight resurgence. Maybe that those two words don't go together, but certainly the decline has stopped, and there are independent bookstores opening regularly, but we're nowhere near having the number of bookstores in an absolute number and certainly per capita number than the country once did.
Until we got to the department stores and then the chain stores, I guess every bookstore was an independent bookstore.
Yeah, the term independent is relatively new and became popularized once Barnes and Noble and Borders became powerhouses. So indie emerged as a brand and identity in contrast to these superstores and larger chains. But you're right, because of that, bookstores were just bookstores. Now, there were corporate bookstores before, there were chain bookstores before, the mall-based bookstores immediately before Barnes and Noble and Borders. But even going back before that, some of the publishers like Scribner's and Doubleday had bookstores in multiple locations, and they were Brentano's. These were chain bookstores, but they weren't nearly as numerous or as dominant as the other corporate bookstores became in the 1990s.
Everybody was worried when we had these big corporate chains taking over. You had the Walden Books, you had the B. Dalton, Borders, boom, boom, boom. And yet, if you look at percentage wise, those guys are gone. Bigger percentage of those big chains are now gone as opposed to the independent. What happened to the big chains? What happened to them?
Yeah, so they competed with each other as much as they were competing with Amazon once it came to the fore. And Borders' demise was helpful to Barnes and Noble for sure, and the market just didn't seem large enough to accommodate all of those stores. Even Barnes and Noble shrunk for a number of years, and this year is beginning to open, I think, 54 new stores, which is the first time in at least 50, maybe 15 years that they've opened that many stores. So the whole brick and mortar landscape was certainly bloodied in the early 2000s, and the rise of Amazon and ebooks, and the corporate bookstores felt it as much as any other kind of bookstore. And I interviewed for this book Len Riggio, who was the kind of the man who made Barnes and Noble into a household name. And I asked him about, criticism that some people have had about Barnes and Noble for killing off independent bookstores. And, he responded pretty frankly to say, look around today. You see a lot of healthy independent bookstores, but you don't see other big chains except for Barnes and Noble. So he sort of sees what Barnes and Noble did as sort of knocking off the other, borders and the other chains more so than the independents. And, that's his perspective. But I will say one of the interesting things to happen is how embraced Barnes and Noble has become among indie booksellers in this now changed landscape of it's not indie versus corporate, it's brick and mortar versus online. And there are a whole host of people who, lament the thought that in-person bookstores might disappear. And, many Americans have loved and still love Barnes and Noble, which might be their only local store. Or even if there's an indie there, many people just prefer it. We have a Barnes and Noble here in Harrisonburg, and it's a great store, and the booksellers there are friendly and knowledgeable.
My Uncle Ezio, when he retired, every morning he went to the diner, got his breakfast, a cup of coffee, and then headed right over to Barnes and Noble. Always went there, sat down, pulled out the book he was reading the day before, kept reading his book or a magazine. There were people there who he had never known until they sat down near him. He got a whole host of friends. And it reminded me of what the old bookstores used to be back at the old corner time, a gathering place of people. They could get their coffee there. They could sit, they talk about books. It's really amazing what they have done.
Yeah, Barnes and Noble has had regulars just like every community independent bookstore, and has its own legions of fans and regulars.
I think one of the things that impresses me is that while I disagree with some of their books that they have there and who they choose to put out and feature, um, no doubt, if you want a book, you're more likely to find it at Barnes and Noble than anywhere else. I mean, they got a lot of books on the shelves. You have to look for them, but I mean, they're there, and they can get them for you in a flash, which is pretty amazing.
Yeah, their stock is still impressive. Some of the newer stores they're opening are decidedly smaller than the superstore, so they're backing off a bit from the notion of trying to have every book or most of the books. But yeah, it's still a place you can find a lot of titles. And um, this book of mine happened to garner some nice attention in magazines, and somebody congratulated me on being in People magazine, and I didn't believe that I was in People magazine. Where did I go? I went to Barnes and Noble. Actually, I sent my parents to Barnes and Noble to find a copy, and I couldn't think of any other place that would have People or most of the other magazines that it carries. Those are grocery stores don't carry the same selection of newspapers and magazines that they used to, and most independent shops don't carry any of that. So they still provide a real service to their communities.
Well, we'll skip on from there to our dear friends at Amazon. Oh my, did they change the way books are sold? And you said brick and mortar now going against the Amazons of the world and other places to do that.
There were many reasons for booksellers to panic over the hundreds of years that there have been bookstores. Booksellers worried when libraries came about that they would put them out of business. They worried that everybody would just watch movies or listen to the radio or watch television, and all those things came to pass eventually. But certainly the most transformative, disruptive, and threatening force has been Amazon, which so suddenly asserted itself as the largest bookseller by wide margins and has completely reshaped the markets of publishing and book selling. And not all in bad ways. There are people who live very far from bookstores. Bookstores have always been congregated in urban areas. Bookstores have tended to concentrate in the Northeast or more wealthy, affluent, well educated, among wealthier, more affluent, and well educated populations. So Amazon democratized access to books. It typically offers discounts. So there's certainly a benefit to it. And publishers had never been as grateful for Amazon as they were during the pandemic when many bookstores closed, but yet people could have access to books. That said, people walking into a bookstore today know that they can get the same exact book delivered by Amazon to their front door tomorrow, often at a cheaper price. And that's made the business of running a bookstore very, very difficult, and has had great and profound consequences on brick and mortar book selling, and will certainly continue to do so.
I know at one time that Amazon used to really do a discount on their paperback books, and you could get paperback books for $6, $7, and all of a sudden, whoop, they went up to 10, 12, $15 for a paperback book. And so, that sort of takes away some of that charm of being able to get a book pretty cheaply on Amazon.
Yeah, well, the most kind of cynical take is that, Amazon at the outset heavily discounted books to gain market share and consumers, and that the larger market share that it gains, the less it needs to discount. And so if it can just successfully garner and dominate the market, then it will no longer have to discount, or at least at the same rates.
Well, now, friends, Dr. Friss takes us from the beginning all the way up to the present time. But since he published his book, there have been a couple things that have happened in the industry that didn't make the book because he didn't know it. First of all, Costco stopped selling books. They made that announcement around a month or two ago. What do you think of that? Why would they do that?
Well, it was kind of funny in the justification, in the PR announcement. It said basically that it was just too hard to keep up with all the new books coming out on Tuesdays. And independent booksellers probably laughed at this because they are, small enterprises that have to and can do this on a weekly basis. And Costco was kind of throwing in the towel. But Costco was one of the largest American booksellers, along with Target, which people don't realize. And of course, Target doesn't typically have huge portions of the store devoted to books, but they do have an aisle or two, and they often have books right near the checkout counter, best-selling kind of books. But they can move a lot of copies of those books, as can Costco. So it's certainly bad news for the bestseller kind of genre, because people would pick them up at Costco. I don't think it's going to have a huge impact on the book selling landscape more generally. And I think it's also just, as I said, kind of, I don't know, an amusing anecdote that maybe sheds some light on just how hard book selling is.
That's true. The other thing which happened is last week, it's announced that for the first time in a 6-month period of time, more Audible books were sold than ebooks. Wow, that's got to be scary for everybody, except maybe Amazon, who sells both. But that could potentially be a game changer, don't you think?
It is already, and when the Kindle first came out, people had good reason to think that brick and mortar bookstores would be no more. This at the pace at which people were adopting it, some simple calculations suggested that the market for physical books would get so small that running a bookstore would be impossible. And of course, that didn't turn out to be the case because the initial enthusiasm for ebooks didn't disappear, but it just plateaued. And so it's hard to know if something similar is happening with audiobooks. I know a lot of people who prefer to listen to books, who, cite their busy lives and like to multitask and listen to audiobooks while they drive or while they walk to work or while they make dinner. And I certainly understand the appeal of that. I never listened to audiobooks. And when my publisher sent me a handful of examples of audio narrators for my book, it took me a while to get used to the genre because I was like, why are they so dramatic here? But I eventually found a narrator that I liked very much who I think did a good job and made it interesting, but not so over the top. But yeah, it's an emerging and important way of distributing books, and I none of us really know, how durable it is, and whether or not this is the future, or whether it's like ebook, something that will increase in popularity to a point and then really just flatline.
All right, and we're gonna get wrapping it up pretty soon. But I think almost every day I get inundated with galleys or net galley or whatever books from publishers that has the word bookstore, bookshop, boom, ba boom, ba boom. You put the word bookstore into a book, and it's like, oh, we're going to publish that. But they're all cozy mysteries. It seems like they're all sort of silly little rom coms. Why do you think it's so popular? The word bookstore in titles.
I think the same reasons that so many of us love visiting bookstores is the same reason that so many people love setting their stories in bookstores. They can be romantic spaces and places of discovery. They can be charming spaces. They can be political spaces. And they're really just great settings for stories. So I don't think that's going to slow down anytime soon.
There was one book I had called The Radcliffe Ladies Book Club. Spectacular book by a lady named Julia Thomas. And it's actually partly in a bookstore, partly at Radcliffe College. But it was very well done. And it wasn't a romantic comedy and it wasn't a cozy mystery, but it was a novel, very well done. I so appreciated Julia for that book. And I do like that. Now, do you have a favorite movie about books?
um, Well, I've certainly seen You've Got Mail many times, which one is one of my wife's favorite movies, and I write about in the book briefly, and is one of the books people most associate with uh, a movie about books. And in terms of books about bookstores, my perennial favorite and go to is 84 Charing Cross Road, which is a series of letters between a New York woman and her preferred London bookseller that I think is just super sweet.
Absolutely. That's Anne Bancroft and is it Anthony Hopkins?
Yeah, I actually never saw the film of it. So the book is by Helene Hanff.
Very, very fine. Well, anyway, I don't want to take up any more of your time, but I just want to ask you, what's next? What's next? A book about bookstores. What's next for Evan Friss?
I'm still trying to figure it out, and doing the best I can to enjoy the ride of this book without getting too far ahead of myself.
As well, you should. I feel honored that you would agree to even come on to my little show. And but we look forward to more for you because there was a little gap between the bicycle books and the bookshop, wasn't there?
Well, it depends what you mean by little, but
A few
To
years.
me, it didn't feel that low. Yeah, I think my last book was 2019, but I'm also, I'm a professor of history. I teach classes. I don't just write from 9 to 5. I have papers to grade and committees to serve on, and writing and scholarship is part of my job, but not exclusively. And all of these books, I hope, bear the perspective of what I'll call, a serious historian. So I do all my own research, and I travel to archives and libraries across the country and dig up primary sources. And it just takes time.
It does. How many bookstores did you have to go to for this book?
At one point, I tried to count and I can't remember, but many, many bookstores. And whenever we were traveling somewhere, even if not for research, I made it a point to stop at every bookstore I could.
Good. That's wonderful. Well, anyway, Dr. Friss, we appreciate you coming on Books and Looks, and we look forward to whatever's going to come next from Evan Friss, because I know I'm going to be reading it.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right, friends, we'll be right back in a moment. Well, thanks a lot again, Dr. Friss. We really appreciate you coming on, telling us all about the history of the American Bookstore. I learned a heck of a lot in this book, and so will you, friends. And you know what? Coming up next week, that's right, next week, coming up, we're going to have a really interesting book for you. It's a novel. It's set in China during the World War I, about 1918. It's called The Foreign Seed. And you know what? This is a wonderful book. We're going to be talking to its author next week here on Books and Looks. So, you don't want to miss that one. Anyway, on behalf of my website, viewsonbooks.com, on behalf of my good friends at Podcast Studio X, this is Blaine DeSantis for Books and Looks, saying may all your leaves be pages in a book.